Good afternoon. Try it down here. Good afternoon. Welcome to the first in our series of campus-wide presentations in leadership for 2006. And I want to just remind you that we're on for the first Friday of each month. This is February, March, April, and May. If you sign up for all four and attend all four, then we'll be printing a whole bunch of certificates in leadership, and that was our goal. Our speaker today is Mike Bleich. He's professor and associate dean, clinical and community affairs in the School of Nursing. He's executive director. He told me not to call it COO, so he knew I would do that, of COO. KU Health Partners. He has an extensive record, even though he looks as young as he does, 30 years of experience in work in healthcare, education, administration, and consultation. And I would say he's consulted worldwide for advice on leadership, which is the topic of our series. Dr. Bleich received his doctoral degree from the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. He also has a master's in public health with a major in patient care, administration, nursing, and he has a BS degree in nursing as well. Milton College. Jim Zorn, the quarterback of the Seattle Seahawks, and then it was very appropriate with the Super Bowl coming, and then they terminated football right afterwards. But Dr. Bleich is one of their most well-known graduates. Dr. Bleich.
Thank you, and I had no idea that you'd make that connection to the Seattle Seahawks. I'm really happy to be here today. I'm first of all happy to have been asked to do this particular presentation because this is a topic that is very near and dear to my heart. I also, it gave me pause to stop and reflect about what would be the best use of this short period of time to try to convey some important leadership lessons. So hopefully I'll be able to do that in the next 50 minutes or so. But the title is Growing in Leadership. And so I'm going to do two things. I'd first of all like to frame a bit about leadership. The second part, I'd like to talk a bit more about the actual growth aspects of leaders. And there are so many people here that represent different positions. I know we have people here from CUPE and the hospital who are clinicians, and I think a very important group, definitely, to look at these and work with these concepts. But we also have faculty and other academic administrators, so I'm very aware that we have just a wide range of faculty and staff here. So hopefully I'll be able to try to find some ways to convey the importance of these concepts to you in a way that reaches out and gives you something to think about perhaps over the weekend before the Super Bowl hits. So in terms of framing the issue of leadership, we live in a very interesting time, and particularly in healthcare. There are clinicians that have become increasingly adept at the personal knowledge that they hold about clinical practice. And when you look at the research enterprise at a university like this, there is no doubt that we spend a lot of time, a lot of effort looking at discovery, new knowledge to help with clinical practice. And yet that clinical practice often gets lost in our organizations today. Because even though we may know a lot about diabetes, or we may know a lot about how to manage congestive heart failure, or we may know a lot about these kinds of clinical issues that we work with, unless they fit into the organizational structure and organizational systems, frequently what we know about best practices never gets to the bedside. And the issue of translational leadership and translational practice is becoming an increasingly important issue. There's discussion about the 10 to 17 years that it takes to get practice to the bedside. And that, in an environment that is as chaotic as that which we find ourselves in, that is unacceptable. It is unacceptable to society and the consumers, the people that we serve. It's unacceptable to many of us who are working so hard to discover new knowledge that if it doesn't embed itself in the organizations that we work and live in, then it frankly is lost for way too long, and we never optimize the scenario that we're about creating. So I think the importance of leadership is critical in terms of what we do and how we begin to understand this as a concept. I remember about 8 years ago when I first was here, there was a conversation with some faculty, and there was a discussion about whether leadership even was a concept that could be taught or should be taught in curriculum. And I am so respectful of the fact that we have come so far as an academic institution in recognizing the importance of leading and managing and following to where we are today, to the point now where we're even having this very successful series to really highlight the importance of it. So framing the issue is important. This is a wonderful picture because it gives you the sense of, from the policy perspective all the way to the discovery perspective, it really shows you the complexity of the systems that we live and work in. You know, Peter Drucker, who died this last year, considered the father of modern management, said healthcare is the most complex organizational structures in the world today. So when we keep that in mind, we have to recognize that we ourselves have put ourselves in careers where we are working in the most complex of all organizational systems and structures. So I like to ask the question, why is there a crisis in leadership? Why is it getting attention? And I think we only have to look back on Hurricane Katrina and on what happened in terms of 9/11. When we go back and look at the leadership that happened or didn't happen, to recognize that today there are more and more focal points that we have taken on to begin to address the attributes we're looking for. I do an exercise with the undergraduate students. I just finished doing this again a couple weeks ago. I've done it about 80 times now, and it really comes from some work out of the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania by Greg Berg. And his work, where he's taken a look at the attributes, something called attribution theory, attributes of leaders. And so he asks groups to identify the attributes they're looking in leaders. So I have the students just kind of free thought, write down what the traits are that they look for in leaders. Then I have them do the same thing with followers, the attributes that they look in followers. And then I have them identify, other than their parents and I have them identify people from the media or from government or from the arts, from the movies, people who have the attributes of leaders, of leadership. And then I have them do leader and follower pairs. Now this is always a fascinating experience because the easiest question that they respond to are always the attributes of the leaders. They want people who are smart, who are intelligent, who are problem solvers, who are highly energetic, and they go on and on and on and on and on. Then when it comes to followers, it's a little more difficult for them. You start to see words that are more negative, like passive, takes direction, so on and so forth. Then you ask them to identify again leaders. And it's fascinating because, well, first of all, at my age, I'm always fascinated by pop culture. So this is always humbling for me because some of the people I do know, but there are many people that I don't know. So I'm always, they enlighten me about who they have images of leaders. Think people like Madonna. Now I know Madonna. I'm not talking about the mother of Jesus. But we are in a position where they will identify people, and then we try to get into that. Then we look at leader-follower pairs. So people will come up with like Jesus and the apostles. Or they'll pick, they used to pick Archie and Edith. But today, 2 years running, they didn't even know when I used that as an example. They were like, who's Archie and Edith? But the reason I do this exercise is always to try to get at the images that they harbor in their subconscious about leaders. And invariably, the people that they select as leaders could never meet the demands. this whole notion of attribution theory, because it's superhuman. It would be impossible for anyone to want to be a leader today. And then when we look at followers, we get into all sorts of mental images and mental dynamics about who are followers. Then we begin to look at relationships that they've had in their families, or we begin to look at relationships that they have in the work setting. And then we get into the hierarchy and the power struggles and the issues of power. And so as we start to tease this apart, then I always take a look at them and find out how many of the leaders, the images of leaders that they harbor, are people that are alive today. Because many of them are dead white men. And that is always the predominant image of leadership. So then we begin to look at why they pick the leader-manager or the leader-follower pairs. And we begin to see that there are some very dominant mental models that get in the way of effective leadership. So when we look at and try to answer the question, why is there a crisis in leadership today? It is because people have attributed so much to a leader that simply people don't want to lead. And the people that are probably best suited to be leaders don't choose to do it. There's no desire for, or there's no willingness to choose to be a leader. So I always say, then the next question for me is, what do we teach and what do we role model in our organizations? Do we really role model leadership? And I'm going to clarify that concept in just a second here. Management, followership. Do we look at this hierarchical notion? We talk a lot today about shared leadership. There's a whole movement afoot with the magnet hospital status. Shared leadership. Is it really shared? Or is it really hierarchical with a little bit of empowerment given to really shared? What does that really mean, shared leadership? And then I always think it's fascinating because we work in this environment that really focuses on critical thinking. How many of you have heard at least one lecture or taken a course on critical thinking? But we don't pair that with critical decision making and critical action. I think that's fascinating because we put so much emphasis on thinking critically, but do we put the same emphasis on acting critically? Because now we're moving to another level of application. So critical thinking without critical application is really someone sitting under a tree pondering life. Then we get into the whole relationship of, do we approach the world from a very linear dynamic, or do we look and begin to look at some of the nonlinear relationships? Many of you have participated in one or more programs that have been highly structured. The implementation of XYZ. We're going to do this, and here's the planning, and we planned for a year, and now we're going to do this, and so on and so forth. And so this very linear notion that everything can be predicted. And the issue for us, and there are so many scientists in this room, is that the scientific process is really geared to, the essence of our education is geared to and is based on this notion of linearity and the ability to predict. So we don't have a lot of balance sometimes in terms of dealing with and reacting to. One has to just look at faculty structures and how decisions get made. Aren't we nimble and fast and nonlinear? No, we are embedded in. You want to slow something down, get it to the right committee. We'll talk about it again in 2 or 3 years. So again, this whole notion of linearity and what it's useful for or what it's not useful for, and how we begin to respond to and react to the times that we're in. Because as much as we would like some linearity in our lives, all of us are working in a very dynamic healthcare environment. In whatever capacity you hold, every single one of you in this room is working in a very nonlinear environment. So we struggle for how do we embed and react to and think about how decisions get made. I'm going to do this very quickly because you can read about this later. But I wanted to give you some clarity because there's been great discussions over time about this whole area of leadership and management in particular. people have tried to say, are they one and the same? And a lot of times these terms are used interchangeably. There are a group of us that have been proposing for some time now, and especially over the last decade, and I think there's a critical mass of us today, that in our publications, in our work, we have separated that there are some fundamental differences between leading and managing. And so I'm going to at least try to really focus very quickly on what those differences are. Simply put, when we're dealing with leadership, we are primarily dealing with the traits that we possess, our capacity to move and to deal and interact with unknown situations. That is one of the clarifying differences. Katrina is a good example. 9/11 was a good example. There was no Rudy Giuliani, for all of the leadership qualities that are being touted about him. If you remember, before 9/11, he was about to lose his job. He was not revered, and now he is, because he turned out not to be a very effective manager, but he turned out to be a very effective leader. There was no way, in spite of all the work we're doing, like in bioterrorism and disaster planning, all those are very linear events. But when you really take that apart, there is no amount of predicting that could ever have accommodated the unknown of where and how that event happened. So what we needed on 9/11 and was essentially provided was leadership, the ability to react to the event, to coerce, to be non-coercive, but clear in communication, and to lay out a vision for what we needed to move forward. So we had a lot of examples of leadership, which seems to have fallen apart in Katrina. In Katrina, no one emerged as a sole figure to provide the sense of purpose and direction to lead us out of that national catastrophe. So comparing just those two events as a good example of leadership, dealing primarily, building and using principles, your knowledge, your experience, the relationships you have, putting those in the context of leading, where you're primarily dealing with scenarios that are unknown. Does this apply to healthcare? When I was up in Toronto a couple years ago doing a presentation in this area, Toronto is still recovering from SARS. It ruined their whole economy for a good amount of time. It is still a point of discussion. We have, the bird flu is upon us, and we're hearing all sorts of things about, these are essentially unknown. We don't know the disease trajectory. We don't know there's no way of predicting. We know some principles about epidemiology. We know some principles about the spread of these diseases. But essentially, we are going to need leadership to handle the unknown nature of these circumstances that we find ourselves dealing with. So the use of individual traits and power, looking at complex health problems where there are no standardized solutions, in partnerships, endpoint goals, and those may be broader than more specific, and we create and adapt as knowledge emerges. So leaders build relationships to empower, and it doesn't involve coercion or manipulation, but rather co-creation. Now I want to talk about management here, because management is where we look at individuals who guide others, and where the series of routine procedures or predefined practice guidelines exist, where there's accountability. And again, in patient situations, which is the context for most of us, these are less ambiguous, the outcomes are generally known, and there is a sequence of prescriptive actions that take place. So if there's a code blue right now, okay, do I want a good leader or do I want a good manager? Probably a good manager would be far more helpful than okay, let's look at him down here on the floor. Let's begin to describe the context of this code. I don't need to know that to begin. We already know. There's ACLS guidelines. And so we like to have people who would know how to function in their roles. And so again, I'm not saying leadership is more important than management. I'm not saying that at all. As long as we're using a sports metaphor, in the time that I spent in Nebraska when Tom Osborne was coach, I thought it was always fascinating to study that dynamic. And actually it was a very good study because given that there are no professional sports teams in Nebraska, they would run news shows every day, 5 minutes, get to know your players as people, and then we would replay championship games. I'm sure they're still on in Walgreens right now. It's a continuous loop of reminder. But one of the things we got to know is that sports program is that under the Osborne era, one of the things that we know is that the structure of management, the prescriptiveness of what they did, how they were prepared, was very ritualized. It was not a random set of, today we're going to do this and tomorrow. It was very prescriptive. Where Tom Osborne made his reputation was the fact on the field, he was an effective leader. He could take all of that management structure and he could contextualize it different. So when faced with the unknown, he knew how to provide direction and build and motivate. So here in one person was not only a good leader, but who was also a very effective manager. Now, my point about this is that when it comes to followership, we are not talking here, as many people have images of, we're not talking about people who are passive and just take direction. We are talking about here people who complement the person who is able to lead or able to manage. And the part about this I'd like to focus on here is this notion of acquiescing. Acquiescence is really important. I can take my own work situation with Dean Miller and the associate deans, and when we meet, one of the things that makes her effective in her role, I think, is the fact that she knows when to lead, she knows when to manage, she knows when to follow. She will acquiesce to her team to let us go and do what we can do. She has a very astute awareness of the knowledge, skills, and abilities of the people working for her. And one of the reasons she's effective is because she moves in and out of those roles. So my point is, we have this hierarchical notion. The person at the top, who's the CEO, is the leader. The mid-managers, the head nurse, those are the managers. So we've got this notion of, and then if you're the staff nurse, God love you, but you're the follower. And so there's no complementary relationship there. Each of us is each of those things. I try to get students to understand that you are leader, you are manager, and you are follower. We are each those things. And I could be the leader in a code situation, and then I could manage it until someone else came along, at which time I would acquiesce. Why should I intubate now that we've got an expert intubator here? I'll move down and I'll be working on keeping the line open. So we work we move in and out of these dynamics as people. So each of us, we really want to develop ourselves as leaders, as managers, as followers. So again, it's not a passive process, but rather a set of behaviors. Now, where have we put our emphasis? And I could go on from here, but I'm not. Managed care, case management, critical pathways, evidence-based practice guidelines, care management, and I could come up with another list equally as long. What have we been teaching students? Leadership, management, or followership? What do you think? A lot of emphasis on management. Not so much on leadership. Not so much on dealing with the unknown. Not so much on adapting and stepping up to the plate. As a matter of fact, one of the things with students we all often have to overcome is we have to move them in. We have to encourage them to get into those leadership scenarios because they're too reticent. So that has a lot to do with, for faculty, of how we coach, how we mentor, how we encourage people into those roles. So if we're going to reclaim leadership as part of the dynamic, and if we believe that in the healthcare system today, that we're going to fundamentally be asked to reinvent ourselves to meet the emerging demands, and there's tons of literature about why that is happening. I'm not going to go into it, but I will share very clearly that something has to change. The systems, which could be another whole lecture we're not doing today, the systems are fundamentally not designed for the baby boomers hitting. The systems are fundamentally not designed. When I was in Taiwan, just in November, the systems there are fascinating because they're so big. 5,000 beds is a typical hospital size. And so 100,000 outpatients coming through a day. So, when you see something big like that, you start to say, how does your oncology practice in outpatient translate? And then we got the Eastern medicine and we got the Western. How does that come together? And it doesn't. There just are no systems. And the thing that's healthy about them is they don't even try to tell you that it does. Whereas here, we spend all of our time trying to tell you it connects. And so we have more case managers. So what are you managing? What do you have the authority to manage if you're a case manager? Well, most people have no authority, and nor do they want authority. I took a case management role so I could disengage from the complexity. No, you should be in the middle of it, leading and managing. We don't have case leaders. So if we're going to reclaim this, we have to look at our stakeholders, the opportunities to be engaged, to be fully alive to those who are to serve and those who are to be served. And again, looking at the capacity, interests, and others. Linear, nonlinear problem solving. We need a more defined set of skills. If all we do is teach people management structures, then as soon as they step out of that management, care management role, they're not armed to act. And so there then is that reticence, there is that hesitancy to act. That is an issue, folks. The engaged reader, again, rewards expansively. We don't have the capacity to reward. Our organizational systems, if you really look in the typical hospital system today, we have 700 to 1 in terms of pages of HR policies, mostly that restrict or deal with some kind of restriction of how to do corrective action, how to get people out of the system, how to do its structure. We don't have freedom to reward. I'd love to tell you the story of the Thanksgiving turkey, but I don't have time. But let me just suggest to you what that is, and if I see you in the hall, I'll tell you more about it. We moved from a $50 gift certificate in an organization Now, this took about a year of management leadership discussion, mind you. So, turkey or $50? Well, for whatever reason, somebody had a contract with the turkey company, so we gave turkeys. And it's still talked about today. It wasn't what people needed. Some of the staff we had in that inner city didn't have electricity. So giving them a turkey to remind them that they have nothing to bake it in exactly isn't the best way to help them celebrate Thanksgiving. So you have to know the people you're with. But you see, that was like we have to treat everyone fairly. So in doing that, we treated most people with disregard. You have to know something about who you're serving to be effective as a leader. So again, embracing complexity and translating it into simplicity. The notion of the complex, our jobs as good leaders is to make it. So here's Mike's maxim. The most critical aspect of leadership is the desire and passion to lead, the capacity to deeply reflect on and learn from leadership activities, a willingness to step out of one's comfort zone, and the ability to build and use relationships for some constructive good. If there is anything I'd like you to leave with today, it's that if you want to be an effective leader, this might be a way of beginning to come up with your own sense of how you lead. I'm going to take a few minutes now to switch gears a little bit so that this doesn't get too theoretical or too far-fetched. Terry Woodbury, who was the past president of the United Way, spoke to one of the organizational behavior and organizational development classes that I taught here early on. I brought in a number of community leaders to tell their stories. And Terry, if any of you have worked with him, is just really one of those deeply reflective, remarkable human beings who have served this community very, very well. And as we work with young students, the way he framed how he developed as a leader was really matches the topic for today, growing in leadership. Terry told the class, because he comes from Western Kansas, a very small community. So the 13 students at Jumbo School and the Parks Church, which had all of 25 members, his youth group, the lessons he learned there was that I'm it, and everybody is a leader. So that was a very early learning for him. And the other early learning he had, again, kind of a paraphrase from Margaret Mead's quote, it only takes a few. It really only takes a few. And by the few, he's talking about to respond to a circumstance or a situation. Someone needs to step to the plate. From the Busy Beavers 4-H Club, which had 20 kids, it was the model meeting competition. He started to think, relax. You can think on your feet. And the other lesson there was that good meetings matter. Now, this whole notion of meetings is fascinating to me because meetings tend to serve a purpose of slowing things down. If we really look at why we meet, a lot of times we say it's to ensure input. But when you look at the dynamics in any given group and the dynamics of leading in a group, it gets to be very complicated very quickly. There's a wonderful book by Lencioni called 5 Dysfunctions of a Team that'd be fun reading for it, and it's a quick read, really. So you might want to take a look at that. But this whole notion of why one meets, it should be about establishing relationships. It should be about clarifying and reinforcing values. John Gardner, who headed up health, education, and welfare and died this last year, said that values die unless they're powerfully regenerated. And so if we value something, integrity, if we value trust, all the things that we talk about in organizations, some people have them on their name tags. We are, you go everywhere, they've got all these honesty. We're about trust, integrity, compassion. Well, that's great. You need a vision, you need mission, and you certainly need a sense of the values that you espouse. But if they're not behaviorally linked, they mean nothing. And if they're not behaviorally celebrated, they mean nothing. They will die. So we can say we're about integrity, but unless we in our department meetings, unless we as we move ahead talk about integrity and examples of it, then we don't have anything in terms of shaping the culture that leads one to a trustworthy and highly integrated culture. So the work there is very, very important in terms of good meetings. And again, they should be about moving things forward. If they're not, don't meet. End the meeting. If there's not movement, if it's primarily for obstructing, then name it and move on. From his Hutchinson, Kansas church and community, he had to deal with a fractured group that he walked into the middle of. And so his notion of leading is to address suffering and pain in people and in organizations, I think is a powerful message. If we think about Katrina, if we think about 9/11, if we think about the scenarios that often play out in people and in organizations, then what we're talking about is this capacity to address suffering and pain. Black and Veatch, management, he talked about diagnosing the real problem takes courage. I was working with one of our doctoral students for an hour and a half yesterday, and I kept asking her why. Why? Because I got what I call public talk, community speak, the things that she thought I wanted to hear. But I knew I was hearing what she wanted me to hear. I wanted her to get to an I statement, like I am about this. I am doing this for this reason. It took me 15 times to kind of keep going. Okay, you're getting closer. And the look of perplexing, frustration at times. It's like, no, you're close. What's really driving your passion for this? So we kept at it. We kept at it. Getting to the real aim, getting to the real purpose, getting to the real problem is not just accepting, symptoms of a problem, symptoms of an issue. And then sometimes the way you have to deal with conflict, either to initiate the reality that it's there. Initiating it doesn't mean you're sparking it, but you're bringing it to the fact that there are issues in the group. And again, one of the speakers that you're going to hear later in this series is going to talk about collaboration and this notion of an even table. And so that deals a lot with how you resolve conflict and whether the table is really even or not. And then again, from his work at Argentine and Franklin, it's about community, and it takes time. And leading, whether paid or not, is a voluntary activity. You step up to the situation, whether or not you're being paid for it. So his final notions were think big. Another issue is it's so hard to get people to think big enough. Frame the issue in a bigger way. We all do so much, just again in faculty dynamics. We improve a course, but we fail to lead by seeing how what we did to improve that course connects to other courses. Getting the best teacher award, but if you're the best teacher, but you don't teach others how to be the best teacher, then that doesn't really do much for the community. So this sense of leading. A lot of the structures we have in an academic environment, grant funding, who's got the biggest grants, they get all those dynamics start to shape individuation, not necessarily community. So we are in a tricky environment. A lot of you work in relative isolation from others. We talk about being the team and whatever, but if you're a researcher, you might have your research team, but there's no one popping in on you on a day-to-day basis to give you the feedback. If you're a teacher out in the community, there's no one running out to see what you're teaching and how you're doing it. These are relative acts of isolation, so that means the coming together, the goal setting, the coming together and how we function makes those meetings so much more important than anything else could be. So, and good things don't happen by accident. Again, leadership is a choice. And then the other astounding thing he said, which I have seen so much of, is that sometimes leadership is lonely. Therefore, it is an act of service. Now, to end, and then open it up for questions. This is a picture of a cow. Checking to see if you're still with me. And you're probably thinking, okay, he's from Wisconsin, maybe it's a cow thing. I would like to just indulge to kind of synthesize this. In preparing for this, I came across a very short chapter, and I'm only read 2 pages from this. But if you would indulge me, I'd like you to kind of think about this in a non-healthcare application. And this is called The Art of Chaotic Leadership by D. Hock. There was a time a few years back when for one brief moment the essence of leadership was crystal clear to me. Strangely, it was after leaving Visa, where he was an executive, and moving to a small, isolated ranch for a life of study and contemplation, raising a few cattle. I was attending to chores in the barn, comfortable and secure from the wind howling about the eaves and the roar of the torrential rain on the tin roof. Through the din, I became aware of the faint, persistent bellowing of one of the cows. Awareness gradually rose that the bellowing was unusual. Flashlight in hand, I plunged into the storm and worked my way across the pasture in the direction of the sound. On the far side, in the circle of light from the flash, I could make out Eunice, the huge one-horned mother cow. Sheltered in the corral to await the imminent birth of her calf, she had somehow gotten out and sought a private place to give birth. Unfortunately, on the brink of a steep bank 15 feet above a flooded creek that raged through a ravine choked with poison oak and wild blackberry vines. I raced to the spot and saw from trampled ground and smashed bushes what had happened. She had given birth. The calf, struggling to gain its feet, had slipped over the edge and plunged down the bank into the creek, then desperately tried to climb the sheer bank to get free of the water. Eunice had done all that she could, racing up and down the bank, bellowing and searching in vain for a way down. By the time I responded to her cries, the calf had been swept downstream beneath tangled vines and brambles. Grabbing at limbs and bushes, I half fell, half stumbled down the sheer bank into the creek. Pushed by the rushing icy water, I worked my way under and through the thickets and brambles. In a bend of the creek 100 feet downstream, I spotted the exhausted calf, fighting to keep its head above water. By the time I arrived, it had given up and was submerged. I pulled it onto the shelf of rocks beneath a mass of tangled growth and began pumping its ribs to eject water and assist with its breathing. It was a magnificent dark red bull calf, the hair on its flank a mass of curls, its soft hoofs torn and bleeding from efforts to climb the bank. It revived a little and began to kick and struggle. Pocketing the flashlight, I managed to heave it across my shoulders and began a struggle upstream toward the place where I had entered and might have had a chance to climb out. Does that sound like leadership, management, or followership? Leadership. What does a one-horned mother cow have to do with leadership? The answer requires a bit of reflection. Let's begin with a few words about words. Words are only secondarily the means by which we communicate. They're primarily the means by which we think. One can scarcely think or talk of organizations or management these days without coming across what leading thinkers from many disciplines believe will be the principal science of the next century: the understanding of autocatalytic, nonlinear, complex adaptive systems, usually referred to as complexity. The word is much too vague to describe such systems. After searching various lexicons in vain for a more suitable word, it seems simpler to construct one. Since such systems, perhaps even life itself, are believed to arise and thrive on the edge of chaos with just enough order to give them pattern, I borrowed the first syllable of each and combined them, and chaord emerged. By chaord, I mean any self-organizing, self-governing, adaptive, nonlinear, complex organism, organization, community, or system, whether physical, biological, or social, the behavior of which harmoniously blends characteristics of both chaos and order. Loosely translated to business, it can be thought of as an organization that harmoniously blends characteristics of competition and cooperation. Or from the perspective of education, an organization that seamlessly blends theoretical and experiential learning. As I learned about the formation and operation of VISA, an early archetype of such organizations, they require a much different consciousness about the leader-follower dichotomy. Leader presumes follower, follower presumes choice. One who is coerced to the purposes, objectives, or preferences of another is not a follower in any true sense of the word, but an object of manipulation. Not is the relationship materially altered, nor is the relationship materially altered if both parties voluntarily accept the dominance of one by the other. A true leader cannot be bound to lead. A true follower cannot be bound to follow. The moment they are bound, they are no longer the leader or the follower. If the behavior of either is compelled either by force, economic necessity, or contractual arrangement, the relationship is altered to one of superior-subordinate, manager-employee, master-servant, or owner-slave. All such relationships are materially different from leader-follower. Induced behavior is the essence of leader-follower. Compelled behavior is the essence of all other relational concepts. Whether behavior is compelled, there you will find tyranny, however benign. Where behavior is induced, there you will find leadership, however powerful. Leadership does not necessarily imply constructive, ethical, open conduct. It is entirely possible to induce destructive, malign, devious behavior, and to do so by corrupt means. Therefore, a clear constructive purpose and compelling ethical principles evoked from and shared by all participants should be the essence of every relationship in every institution. A vital question is how to ensure that those who lead are constructive, ethical, open, and honest. The answer is to follow those who behave in that manner. It comes down to both individual and collective sense of where and how people choose to be led. In a very real sense, followers lead by choosing where to be led. Where an organizational community will be led is inseparable from shared values and belief of its members. True leaders are those who epitomize the general sense of the community, who symbolize, legitimize, and strengthen behavior in accordance with the sense of community, who enable its shared purpose, values, and beliefs to emerge and be transmitted. A true leader's behavior is induced by the behavior of every individual choosing where to be led. And with that, I invite you to leadership. Thank you, and now I am open for questions. Yes.
I'm not trying to be a smart aleck, but it's going to sound like that. You say that leadership is the important thing with leadership is being flexible and being able to respond to novel situations. Then you say you want to define that set of skills. Can you connect those two for me?
To define the set of skills?
That you need for leadership.
Yes. The set of skills are more about a set of principles, and the skills rest in the principles, not in recipes that give you a step-by-step predictive linear notion. And the best reference to this is John Gardner's book called On Leadership. This is a profound book, and in there he describes the tasks of leadership, which you will find like 11 really critical principles. And he does that as well as anyone in terms of talking somewhat about attributes, somewhat about traits, somewhat about principles to guide one's action. Other questions?
Quiet group. Sue.
Thank you very much. That was really an interesting lecture. What happened to the calf, first off?
It never says.
Oh, okay.
But if you think about the circumstance at hand, I would anticipate that the outcome was positive, because at that time the breathing had resumed, and we can presume that from there on that there was a good pulmonary functions.
As a lung doctor,
with
I'm
pulmonary
really
functions kind of going in the right direction from a systems perspective.
Okay. Well, my question relates to how do you teach leadership? This is an education institution. We have leaders in all aspects of our schools, and as educators, we're responsible not only to teach the substrate, if you will, the nuts and bolts, but to teach leadership. And as someone who's been around a while, it seems difficult to me. So particularly I'd like you to focus your question your answer to my question to leaders as they transition from more followers to more leaders. Does everybody need to go through a leadership course? I mean, these are already people with their terminal degrees, and what do you recommend as a good leadership education?
Well, the first thing I would say is that the conceptual clarity between leading, managing, and following has to be understood, because there are different theoretical models that drive each. A lot of people here believe that leading and managing and following theories are all the same, and that organizational theory which may include something about leading, but that they're all somehow clustered together. So the first thing is to get serious about knowing that conceptually there is a difference between leading and managing, because once you get a clarity about that, then you know the kinds of behaviors that you begin to look for. So that would be the first thing, is to get grounded in the conceptual focus of what each demands. Then the second part is to always recognize that, just like with any other course of study, once you know something about the topic at hand, you begin to explore the fact that no student comes to us in any of the biological science areas or any of the clinical, we all have life experience. We have all been leaders. We have all been, as a matter of fact, just watch a 3-year-old manage his parents or her parents. One only needs to go back to that level to say, okay, many of these are innate. One of the reasons it's difficult to teach is because we have to tap into self-reflection skills. So I would say that it is easier to teach management because we're talking about a prescribed set of actions. There is a best way to hire someone. There is a best way, perhaps, to go through and provide clinical care to a particular subgrouping of patients. So management is probably the easier thing to tap into. Leadership has to do a lot with self-concept and self-perception and willingness to take risk. And I think that those opportunities exist every single day in our lives. You don't get to work in the morning without probably doing something where you have to encounter some unknown scenario where you're not leading when you're driving your car. In the sense, the difference is, the relationship with the cars around you. So if you come across a huge accident, you go into kind of a leadership mode. So it's not like we have to look for opportunities to lead. We just have to discover leadership in the opportunities that are there. So when you're dealing with patients, there's a lot that we can do by slapping on a diagnostic code with that patient. And so there we could say, well, from here on, we're managing. But most patients don't present anymore a very clean trajectory. So I think this is a huge opportunity in leadership right now. Patients, as we grow older, come in with multiple we know virtually next to nothing about how various disease structures, management, co-create, co-combine. So you don't come in with just diabetes, you come in with diabetes and heart disease, and then you come in with arthritis, and then, oh, by the way, you're unemployed, or by the way, you can't figure out how to get Medicare Part D. So all of that is all part of the reality of. So there's an opportunity for leadership in working right there. What principles do we know from that which we have knowledge of? So we can maybe begin to manage. But then how do we really lead? How do we really make a difference? How comfortable are we in dealing with the unknown? And that's where I think, all of us can take a look at the scenarios we find ourselves in and say, where's my opportunity to lead here? I'm doing it for myself, the department, my unit. Where can I connect? It's not like there aren't opportunities. Where are there opportunities for me to exert leadership? One of the things I do with all of my graduate students in the organizational leadership track is I hook them in their very first course to a national mentor, someone who has a prominent mentorship role to help them think big and to help them think beyond mom and dad and maybe their favorite instructor. It may be a rabbi, priest, minister, whatever. Those are the early images of who people cling to. So getting exposure to someone who will help them take those risks. And then giving feedback about what was that like? Was it okay? What was the outcome? Did you have to fear something in it? What did you lose? What were the relationships you had to draw on? What relationships should you have drawn on? There's a time and place to tap into the power of the network. And many clinicians don't do it. They just feel, okay, I can't do anything about it, so therefore, well, no, there are people in positions. There are people that you have. How do you help them connect so that you can build those relationships to move them into that dynamic? That's critical in that whole leadership dynamic.
Same question about how do you teach somebody to be a clinician or a good teacher or a good salesperson. I think you can expose people to a variety of courses and workshops and symposia on the principles of doing that. But you've got to admit there has to be, I would argue, a natural affinity for that particular quality. Leaders emerge. Good teachers emerge. Some people are good teachers and good leaders and clinicians. They've got it all. Some take as many courses on leadership it is, and they're still lousy at it. So, I would argue that a natural affinity for those qualities also has to be there.
Okay, don't confuse role with leadership. Because well, first of all, I would tell you, you're a trait theorist, because that is trait theory, that leaders are born and not made.
Is that a good thing or a bad thing?
Well, let me tell you that trait theory has continued to surface to the point, from a research perspective, that there are 5 or 6 traits that are actually pretty consistently present in people who are effective leaders. But I think that we tend to look at people in roles as leaders, and we separate out. It doesn't matter what role, as a grandfather, as a husband, all of those roles you're talking about natural affinity. So you're talking about natural affinity in the context of the way you live your life. So are you a leader in all of those areas? It's about choice. So I think there are attributes that people naturally have. I think there are other areas where self-discovery comes at critical points in time. And one becomes a better leader maybe after the loss of a parent, where someone fundamentally rethinks life and its values and what it's about. And you lead differently. I do think there are life events. I think for many in Katrina, they will be fundamentally changed by that lived experience. Therefore, they will lead differently. So I see it as an ongoing evolution, an ongoing process. But I think too often we think still in roles. You know, I'm a faculty member or I'm a teacher, and so whether I'm good or bad may or may not have anything to do with leadership. But I do think that there are people who have better capacity for self-reflection than others. I do think there are people who find more comfort in being a good follower, and they migrate to they let leaders lead. It's not that they couldn't, and there's the difference. You know, in the absence of the leader, can I still function? Can I still become that leader? Can I step to the plate? If the answer is no, then developmentally I need to think about why and how and what's blocking me from that. So the thing that becomes more intimate about teaching leadership and teaching particularly leadership, not so much management, but it's particularly teaching leadership, is you have to meet people on their journey. You have to build on where they're at. And that's where there is science that's growing around how to do this and how to get people to have certain kinds of experiences and how to help people break through. There are tools to get people to break through in terms of their capacity for self-reflection. But the other thing you have to be careful of is there's a lot of stuff out there that is just fad. It isn't really to do any of that. And so people have made millions, you know. One day go to, you know, Tony Smith's workshop out at the Overland Park, you know, Convention Center, and you will emerge as a new leader. You know, what's Tony got that? You know, he's been hiding for the rest of the world and what, you know. So you have to be on the lookout for that. But yes, just because you're in a role doesn't mean you're going to be good in that role. And there are times when you're going to be a better leader in some scenarios than others because of your life experience. There may be times when you're a great leader, but in another situation, you may be a modest leader. You know, it's the timing, it's the sequence, it's the matter of the relationships you can tap. In the book, The Tipping Point, which a lot of you have probably had explored, Gladwell talks about, why don't we know, when Paul Revere, we all know about Paul, he went to the south, who went to the north? You know, why don't we know who that person is? It was about leadership skills and relationships and the connectivity that person had. So we still talk about Paul Revere today. The British are coming, but we don't know what the message was. So can you learn something about how to, as a leader, to deliver the message? Yes, that can be learned. Strategies to help your effect can be learned. And then maybe we would know. It was an Italian who went to the north, John. I don't know. Yeah. Okay, we're out of time. Thank you so much for being here today. I appreciate it.